It's really good to be back in Buzzacott. This is the first time I've been back in this office since something like the 14th of March 2020. And just walking into the office today, it almost felt as if I'd never been here. And I suppose that makes you reflect on how quickly time goes.
Yes.
I think if you just think back 20 years, many of our mutual clients, were thinking about probably hiving off schools, thinking about some of their other institutions, whether they wanted to keep them, whether they wanted to close them, and so on. And now I think time has moved on and there's another wave of really serious discernment to be had. And that really is about their own future, the future of care, of the members of the community, but also what their long-term legacy is. From my perspective, when I talk to my clients at the moment, whether that be congregational leaders or whether it be provincial bursars, there's one thing that always comes back in conversation, and that's, how are we going to look after our members who, let's face it, like us all, they're getting older. But many of them nowadays are facing the reality that there is increasingly expensive care to be provided to many of those members. And I think for congregational leaders, they're thinking about what does that mean in terms of emotional strains. But bursars are obviously also worried about the financial costs of it as well. And I think that there are three aspects, aren't they, to thinking about the long-term future of sisters or members of communities who are actually here. And that probably is the cost of care.
Yes.
But linked very much to that, in my mind, would be property needs and probably then investments and the monetary needs. Would that sort of chime with what you're experiencing?
I think that's right. And I think certainly, again, looking back over the last 20 years, many congregations were very much asset rich but cash poor. And obviously, again, we've seen congregations start to dispose of properties and move away from institutions. And that's given them a more financial security. That's also meant, yes, they need to think more carefully how they approach quite a lot of these issues. And I think turning to look first at that question of care, the question I'm always asked is about public benefit.
Yeah.
And how can you square this idea of we're providing care to ourselves with being a charity delivering public benefit? And I think it's always important to remember that the members of the congregation are actually part of the beneficial class of the charity, and that supporting the members of the congregation when they're in need through old age, that is a way of delivering public benefit. And I think congregations shouldn't be embarrassed about slightly looking inward and thinking about their own members, because again, it's the members who've provided the mission and the services over previous years.
Exactly.
And it's right to look after them. But it is that question about how do you deliver that care? And is it something that the congregation should be doing themselves, or do they think about buying it in?
Yeah, because if you go back probably more than 20 years, but the tradition has always been that the younger members of the congregation cared for the older members. And now, because of the way religious life has changed, there are probably very few younger members who can spare the time and look after the older members. So I think many of them are thinking about, well, do we actually provide care and bring staff in to help us run our own facility? Is that a facility just for ourselves, or is it a facility that we also take in members of the public and care for them? And there are some who I think are facing the reality that perhaps possibly that's not an answer for them, and they need to be looking to move members to care homes either run by other religious or by third parties. And all of those things involve really serious emotional questions, I think. And it's not something that a leadership team can just make a decision on in isolation. I think there is a need for real discernment, but I do think that if congregations haven't started that conversation, they need to do so pretty soon. And it's about asking members, where do you want to be cared for? Where do you want to live your last few years? What sort of care do you want? And thinking about where and how that relates to the ongoing ministry that more active sisters are, I would imagine, continuing to want to provide for as long as they possibly can.
Yes, and I think there's that issue always, isn't there? We're thinking about delivering the care internally, that if you are going to look at providing it to other people as well, you start getting into a very regulated activity. And actually, there's perhaps a need to think about, is that part of the mission of the congregation, or are we simply doing this because we have an opportunity and a need for ourselves? And I think as part of that longer term planning, if a congregation is looking at moving into providing care for other people, they also need to think about an exit strategy for that. Yeah. Because coming to a point where you can no longer continue to run a care home yourselves can lead to very difficult decisions, not least about what do you do about your own members of the congregation who are there, but what do you do about members of the public who are living there. So I think it does become a very difficult question about where should you deliver care and how should you do it. And you're right, all those points about the emotional attachment and also the geographical areas. Because quite often I think communities have been based in areas where there's been a particular need for part of the mission, which isn't necessarily always the best place for the delivery of care.
No, and I think it's also important to think about the people who are perhaps receiving care. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are not also able to continue some form of mission. And that sort of passive mission or whatever, I think is quite important to think about. I know one of my clients, they've really looked at where they want to be geographically. So traditionally they've been across the whole country, and what they're now doing is moving into 3 or 4 what they're calling hubs, and within those hubs, which are sort of interspersed across the country, you've got 3 aspects. You've got a care facility for older members of the community. You've got some active sisters who are actually going out and doing ministry themselves. And then you've got some form of traditional work that probably the sisters are less involved in now, but is carried out by lay people. And what they're trying to do is to keep, for as long as possible, the relationship between those 3 aspects really paramount, so that you've got the work that's being done by lay people. That's something that they can look on and say, that's something that we founded. It is blossoming. It's really providing public benefit within the wider community. You've got the active sisters who are carrying out their own ministry, and then you've got those in care. And the idea is that those that are receiving care can be kept informed, and they can observe all of this other work going on around them, so they actually feel part of it. And whether it's just prayer ministry or whatever, but actually that sense of community is still there. And I think that's one pattern I'm seeing emerge. I think that contrasts with the other that I'm seeing, which is where you have got a care facility, but then you've got more active sisters, and increasingly some of them becoming individual living sisters, if you like, and living in flats or houses on their own and carrying out their own individual ministry. And I suppose in that latter way of living, you've got the concern about how long is that sustainable with those sisters living individually and possibly, quite far dispersed as well.
I think it's interesting because I think, again, if you look back 40, 50 years when life expectancy wasn't quite as long as it is now, I think you wouldn't have had this concept of people reaching a point where they wanted to go off and live individually. But in some ways, it's almost akin to retirement, isn't it? But again, I think, yes, you're right. There's questions about sustainability, about individual living and how that fits with community life. And I think also when you've got smaller communities of 2 or 3 people, I think there's this question about vulnerability and who is actually responsible for ensuring that everyone is looked after and protected properly and that their needs are being met. And that becomes much, much harder for trustees if there are dispersed communities. And I think we will see challenges coming through from that concept as we go forward. And I think, again, it's one of those things that tends to get overlooked sometimes in the care home setting as well, which is who is actually the advocate for the members of the congregation who are living in the care home. Because we're all used to the congregational structure and how people fall in line with what the superior and the congregational leadership team say would like to be done. But of course, if you move outside of the congregational structure, there is very much the idea of the individual's needs coming first, and if the individual's unable to explain for themselves what they want, that somebody's there to advocate for them.
Yeah, and I think increasingly over the last 50 years, members' families, their own individual families, have also become more involved and more of a view that they should also have a say. And you've got this tension, haven't you, almost?
Yes, and I think, interestingly, I've noted a few individuals wanting to be moved back nearer to where their families are as well, which again, you can see then the families becoming more involved in what the care needs are and how it's being delivered. And that's again something that needs a lot of careful planning, because we all know the issues with lasting powers of attorney and next of kin and so on. And I think if congregations are going to move towards this more individual way of living, they do need to carefully plan and involve family members and get them to understand where the responsibilities sit and who actually is going to be the paramount person saying this is what this individual's needs are.
Yeah, I think there's an awful lot to consider there. I think the other thing that needs to be considered in all of this is the cost, because each of these different options, of course, does have a different cost. And whilst finance shouldn't be the tail that wags the dog, I think the need to think very carefully about what the various options are and then to think about some financial planning is absolutely crucial. I'm in no doubt that many congregations have got the resources that they need to ensure that they can care for the rest of the natural lives of their members. But it's going to take some time, and one of the key elements of that, of course, is property strategy.
Yeah.
So, what properties do we keep, when do we sell them, and so on. But that has to be also linked to an investment strategy and thinking about your financial reserves more generally. I think in terms of the property needs, there is a need more generally to just do a property strategy, to look at all of the property portfolio that the congregations have got at the moment. And let's face it, some of them have disposed of some pretty large properties in recent years, but they are still, some of them, sitting on quite substantial assets. And I think there is a need to think about whether those properties are going to be suitable going forward, for caring for sisters, for enabling sisters who are in ministry to live in them, what work needs to be done, how expensive that's going to be. And there are legal issues as well, aren't there, like covenants and such like, and land registry.
It's interesting because again also there's the sort of the public benefit question, which certainly a congregation I've been working with, they're a very small community now, but they're in a 40-room monastery, and they've been debating, is it right for them to continue to hold on to that property, which is a sizable property, when there's only a few of them living there. And of course that does raise questions about public benefit and private benefit. And I think how I've always viewed it is, if it was a case of a community of 6 were going out today to decide to buy a huge property, I think that would be wrong. But if it's something that you've already got, there's no requirement to get rid of it simply because perhaps it's a bit too big for you now. But then that rolls into a whole lot of other property issues. So yes, is it actually a property they can sell, or is it covered by some kind of special trust or restrictive covenants? And then is it actually suitable for their needs?
Yeah.
And the biggest issue that they've actually faced is that they've accepted that it's not suitable for their needs, it's the wrong property, but it's in the right place. And if they move out of it, it's going to be very painfully emotionally, because it's somewhere that they've been for a couple of 100 years. And it's also going to mean that they cease to be the heart of that particular community, which in many ways has been built around the work that they were doing in the area. And so that's a very difficult decision for them. But at what point do they put themselves first and say, actually, we need to do what is right for us and our future needs, as opposed to being there to support the wider community who've always enjoyed having us live amongst them?
Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons why I would always advise many congregations at the moment to just talk to their property advisors, because I think there are opportunities as well with some of these larger, older properties. Often they are in quite significant grounds. And I've certainly got one client at the moment, similar to what you've just described, Tim, where they've got a very almost historic building that they're living in, but it's, massive high ceilings, costs a fortune to actually heat, is not at all suitable for people who are less mobile than perhaps they were. And so one of the things they're considering is actually working with a developer to develop that property into a number of pretty high quality apartments, but at the same time to obtain planning permission to build in the grounds a sort of purpose-built convent that's suitable for the sisters nowadays. And that's got the benefit of, they retain that location in the community, the wider community. They are still near their old property. Whether that's a positive or a negative, I don't know. But I think, all of this comes from just talking to people who are experts in the field of planning and what you can do with particular properties. And I don't think there's any harm at all if you are in that position at the moment of just having an hour or two brainstorming with your property advisors to see what's possible. And even, it may be possible within an existing property to adapt it, to develop it for your own needs. But you need to understand how costly that's going to be, how expensive, and so on.
And I think it's interesting for those congregations as sort of part of international congregations to have the situation that if they're starting to find that members of the overseas congregation are becoming the trustees, they may be looking at these property assets and saying that's a very large figure on our balance sheet, and that is an asset we could be disposing of and be using for other purposes. But then thinking what you were saying there about the whole idea of being part of the community and repurposing it. And do you think that the overseas trustees always understand that that's an option?
I think there is a need to provide some formation for overseas trustees, to induct them more. Just going back to what we were discussing a moment ago, the whole way in which care is organised in this country, I think one of the things that often comes as a huge surprise to people who are not far away, in Europe, is the sheer cost of actually providing care in this country. And when it comes to it, if you want really high quality care, the limited amount that the government is actually prepared to contribute towards that. So I do think that, looking forward, it's probably going to be the lay trustees or overseas trustees that are managing the provision of care and the property assets of the congregation as time goes by. And they do need, I think, to understand the way things are done in the UK, but also it's important that they also talk to the sisters who are here, to the members of the congregation who are here, who've lived their lives here, because I do think there is a need to take their views into account and to plan for the future in the way that they would want their future decided.
And I think, again, we've seen congregations build up quite sizable designated reserves for dealing with care. And sometimes, again, that can be a source of embarrassment because it can be a large figure on the balance sheet. And I think, obviously, it's something that needs to be constantly assessed. But do you think congregations can ever over-reserve for their care needs?
Because I'm an accountant, I suppose, I'm very sort of prudent. So I would always want congregations to have slightly more money put aside than they potentially are ever going to need. I think the danger is that you've got the green paper that's just been issued by the government in terms of the future of care, future of social care in particular. I think the government has been quite clever in the way that it has sold that, and many people are of the view that that's their care needs sorted. They will have to spend some of their money, but after that, the government will provide. That isn't the case. I mean, what the government is talking about in the green paper is simply the cost of care. On top of that, you've got the cost of the hotel, if you like, so the accommodation, all of the ancillary needs, none of which is going to be funded by government, and all has to be funded by the individual. And so even with the changes in social care, I think there is a need for congregations to be setting aside quite substantial sums of money. I also think that, there are going to be some significant property sales in the future for some of these congregations. That money possibly will come in and be available for the future cost of caring, but in many congregations, those properties, once they're sold, the proceeds are required to go to the generalate overseas. So there is an element of discount in that. And I'm beginning to see some congregations, particularly those that are moving into grant making, who are perhaps less cautious than I would like. So they are beginning to spend money and to think, well, this we can give and further our mission by enabling other people to take forward our work, and sometimes forgetting that they will need that money set aside. Inevitably, those reserves are probably only going to go one way now, and that's downwards. But I think it needs to be done in a very cautious and measured way. And the worst thing that can happen is for a congregation to have given away its money, or to have sent the money overseas for whatever purpose, and then to find in 10 years' time that it hasn't got enough to care for its members. And I'd rather congregations took it slowly until they were absolutely sure that they had no need for that money themselves, and then they could take a view. But that doesn't mean that they can't start to plan for that now. And I think they should. One of the things that I always say to congregations, and I always feel slightly bad saying this, but I think congregations should be planning for their future now, whilst they've got members who can make those decisions and make those plans, rather than in 10 years' time, where actually, it's too much for anybody to really think about. And other people then take control, and it's possibly not what they would have wanted.
No, that's right. And I think that's something we'll touch on more probably in the next session, isn't it? I think thinking back to what you were saying there about sales of properties releasing large amounts of money, again, I think there's always that tension, isn't there, with the local congregation and the international arm. And I think that feeling of perhaps wanting to respect the wishes of the donors who've perhaps helped contribute to that institution in the first place, and whether actually it's right to spend the funds elsewhere or even on providing care when perhaps it should be being spent to further the mission. But I think, again, thinking back to what we talked about right at the beginning, it's about remembering that part of delivering public benefit is looking after those members of the congregation who are themselves in need.
I agree, and I think we'll touch on it in the next session, but I do think that one of the important things to give some thought to is almost, if you were an elderly couple and you were thinking, well, what do we want to happen to our estate when we are no longer here? Congregations almost need to be thinking about that now, and thinking about, do they want their assets to revert back to the generalate and be used for the wider congregation? And a number will want that. But equally, I know from discussions I've had with some of my clients, some of them feel quite strongly that they have worked all of their lives, and their predecessors worked all of their lives to provide work and benefit in this country probably have founded organisations that are now independent and so on, and really want their assets to be used to continue that work here in the UK. So it is a very difficult question, but again, I go back to the fact that I think those discussions should be taking place now, because in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, it's too late.
And as you said earlier, I think a lot of that also comes back to looking at property and a property strategy. And I think there are two key things for me when thinking about property strategy. One, obviously, is whether the buildings are still environmentally appropriate. Obviously, climate change and COP26 at the moment, lots of issues around that. But also, when we talked earlier about individuals living in smaller communities, I think part of the problem with some of the older properties is sometimes around security.
Yeah.
And actually whether older members of the congregation living together, perhaps when they've used to be having a sort of open door policy with members of the parish, whether that is still something right, and whether actually properties are suitable for the purposes they're being used for.
Yeah, I think security is one of the key issues. Sadly, it's the way the world is at the moment. Most people who are not members of religious congregations, even when they're in their house, probably have their front door locked. And we hear about the need to educate all older people to be very careful when somebody does knock on the door and starts to talk about things that they're not being conned, they're not being scammed in any way. And that same concern is there for individual members of congregations who are living alone and becoming more elderly. There is that security issue. And some of those will be living not just in owned accommodation, because we're talking really about disposing of properties, but I can think of a number of congregations where a large number of the members are in rented accommodation because it sort of goes with the job. Yeah. So they live near a presbytery and the property is owned by the diocese. I suppose the question that needs to be asked is whether that arrangement will continue, or at some point, once the sister needs care, needs perhaps just slightly more help than she may be getting at the moment, does that offer of accommodation cease to exist, and actually the congregation will need to find additional accommodation. So maybe purchases as well as sales that some of our clients are actually thinking about.
I think the other thing that has been interesting in the last couple of years is obviously people looking at surplus property and trying to work out if it could be used to help further the mission. And obviously we had the whole refugee crisis and people looking for ways to help refugees and provide them with accommodation. And that's something that I think congregations have had to approach very carefully, because it's very easy to say, yes, we've got 2 or 3 spare rooms, but then think about the difficulties of inviting somebody in to live with you when they're not part of the community and they might be of a different age profile. And I don't know if you've seen many of your clients going down the route of opening the doors to those types of activity.
We did in the early days. We saw certainly a number of clients who were very interested in doing that. I think many of them, once they'd explored it in more detail, realised that it wasn't quite as simple as they would have hoped. And so we certainly have clients now with surplus houses where they are perhaps leasing them to a local authority and allowing the local authority to house refugees and so on. But I think that also brings in the whole question of investment property more generally, and whether, if a property is surplus to needs, should you sell it, or should you try and find a tenant to generate an income? I think there are pros and cons of the two. The question I would always ask anybody who was thinking of renting out a property is, do you really want to be a landlord? And have you thought through all of the implications of being a landlord? And you must see some examples of real problems that have been created by that sort of scenario.
Yes, I mean, certainly thinking back over what's happened in the pandemic as well, having a tenant in there who then perhaps finds a reason why they shouldn't be paying the rent can be very difficult, especially if you're a charity. And obviously tenants can be saying, you're a charity, therefore you'll let us off the rent, and of course forgetting the longer term impact for the charity of not getting the investment income that it was expecting. But yes, and also there's that real issue between, is the property being used as part of our mission by renting it out, or is it simply an investment? And I think one of those questions then becomes, if we're using a lot of properties as investments, whether we've not diversified properly in terms of our trustee duties.
And I think also diversified in terms of our investment portfolio, because if they also have listed investments, the probability is that some of those listed investments will be in property companies. And if you look then at the whole area of investment, it could be that it is very much skewed towards property. So I think if congregations are looking to use their own properties and to use them as investment properties, they ought at least to be talking to their investment managers to inform them of that situation, because I think that would then alter the strategy that the investment managers would take in terms of listed investments. So, all of those considerations are very, very important.
And I think one of the other issues with being a landlord is actually asking yourself what's going to happen at the end of the lease. And I know certainly in the past it was very common, for example, when hiving off a school, that you would grant the school a lease of the property, partly because there was a feeling of wanting to retain that connection, partly a feeling of, is it something that's going to succeed or not? And if it doesn't succeed, we want to be able to use the land for other purposes. And also partly a sort of feeling of control. And I think, again, in the early days, that all made perfect sense. But if you get to a point where you've still got 100 years to run on the lease, and it has really very little value on your balance sheet, it's not a lease you're ever going to say to the school, well, actually, that's it, we're now going to bring an end to it so we can sell the freehold. It starts to become, what is the purpose that you're holding it for? And it's that sort of problem waiting to be dealt with, isn't it? And I think a lot of congregations perhaps need to look at their property portfolio, look at those reversionary interests, and start to think, why do we hold on to that?
Yeah.
Do we still have a link, or should we be looking at moving forward?
I think also it's important to have some form of register of what those reversionary interests are. I mean, you must have seen this with a number of our clients converting to CIOs from charitable trusts, where there is a need to amend the reversionary interest, and suddenly finding, that some of these congregations do have interests in land that have long been forgotten.
Yes, I mean, that's always an interesting experience for us when we do an incorporation, because we almost certainly quite often find a piece of land that people have forgotten about. We've had one recently where we've discovered a piece of land that is registered still in the name of a previous trustee of a previous charity that's dissolved and merged into another one. And that causes lots of problems that have to be dealt with. The other issue from not having a sort of property register is, again, we find that people say, well, we know that we own a particular piece of land, but we're not quite sure where it is, but it was very important that we should keep it because it had some huge ransom value or something like that. And you start to realise that that's a memory from what somebody did on a previous team 3 or 4 terms before. And when you look into it, it was actually disposed of, but people tend to forget. So it is useful to keep a sort of overall register of the property. And then, as you say, balance it against the listed investments and think, are we too heavily invested in our properties as well?
Yeah. And do you find that there are many congregations that possibly still have properties that are not registered with the land registry?
It's becoming much rarer, but again, we do occasionally come across it. And obviously, when you're doing your audit and you ask the client to produce the title to it, and we then have to go scurrying off and finding the deeds. And again, I think if you've lived in a property for 200 or 300 years, in some cases, you don't ever really think about it.
No.
But when you come to start looking at some of the ideas that you mentioned earlier, like development or perhaps selling part of it, that's when these issues start to become really significant. And most, I think, of my property colleagues would say it's a good idea just to get on and register everything now. So you've then dealt with all of those issues. You can prove what you own and what you don't own. And then you don't have these difficult conversations later on. And in particular, I know graveyards is one that we always struggle with because people have let them to other people and then forgotten who's responsible for looking after them and things like that.
And presumably that would be the same with covenants that probably have been there for many, many years and may just need to be sorted out, really.
Yes, because again, it used in the past to be quite common when you dispose of a property to put in particular covenants against preventing future use on the property of things that were perhaps considered anti-Catholic. And again, a lot of those are perhaps no longer relevant because people have moved on and there's no presence still of the community in the area.
Yeah. I think when some of our clients dispose of properties, inevitably, as I said, some of them will transfer money automatically overseas to their generalate, but many will be in the position of thinking about whether they should invest the money, particularly with investment managers. Many of them now do have investment managers, and there are a few investment managers who are renowned for working with religious, so they understand them. But I do think that, again, it's one of those key relationships for the future, the relationship between the congregation and its investment manager. And I think as they have this process of discernment, one of the individuals or one of the groups of individuals they need to be just keeping informed are the investment managers, because the strategy inevitably will possibly change. I suppose over the last 20, 30 years, the money that they've been building up in investments really has been akin to a pension fund. And as we go forward, we're now moving into that pension fund, entering a new stage where it's starting to pay out money rather than accumulate for the future. And so just talking to your investment managers, if you're a congregation, I think is absolutely paramount importance now going forward. And alongside that, the one thing that I know many congregations are talking to their investment managers about is the ethical policy. And of course, that's a hugely tangled web at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very difficult one, isn't it? Because charities have always struggled with this idea of, do you invest to get the best return and maximise the money available for your charitable purposes? Or should you invest in a way that is ethical and in line with your duties as charity trustees to further the objects of the charity? And I know that the Charity Commission have been consulting on this and their investment guidance, and the answers coming out of that have never really been very clear.
Yeah.
And it's a very grey area. But we've certainly seen a lot of investment managers promoting much more ethical funds, much more ethical ways of investing, which is wonderful. But obviously there's that question of, is it appropriate that you leave it to your investments to do the ethical activity for you, but then you perhaps continue to keep a very large property with a massive gas boiler and those types of issues? And I think it's that question, isn't it? If you're going to have an ethical policy, does it have to be just about your investments, or is it your wider behaviour and what you do as a congregation? And again, the dispersed communities, is that leading to more travel and all these types of issues?
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you look at the few charities that have been caught out by the media in terms of media starting to look at what they're investing in, it has been very much by comparing what they're investing in to the way they're actually carrying out the rest of their activities and saying, well, there's an element of hypocrisy here because you're telling other companies that you're not going to invest in them because you don't like the way they're operating, but then look at yourselves and the way you're living and so on. So there is an absolute need, I think, and particularly in the way the world is at the moment. As you say, the environment is so topical with COP26 and so on. But I know that, again, I think this is such a tangled web and there's no right or wrong answer. Some congregations have just divested from fossil fuels. Others have decided to retain some investment with some of the big oil companies, for example, because they believe the way forward is dialogue. There's no right or wrong answer, as I said, but I do think it's about talking to your investment managers and making sure you're comfortable with the way they are managing the investments.
Would you expect the investment manager to be leading that conversation, or would you expect the trustees to be the ones going to the investment manager and saying, we've got concerns about our investments from an ethical point of view?
I would hope that in most cases, if your investment manager understands you, so they know as a congregation what you're about, I think they should be asking some key leading questions. But if they're not, then I think the congregations themselves should be raising the issues. And if they don't like the answers they're getting, that probably leads them to think, well, are we with the right investment manager? But I think it's a conversation to be had, because sometimes it's one of those subjects that seems quite simplistic. And, well, we don't want to invest in this company because we don't like what they're doing. But you might be investing in the bank that's lending money to that company to enable it to carry on what it's doing. And so, it's a much wider discussion. And I think somebody like an investment manager who's got that breadth of understanding can often bring a slightly different picture to be had. And so, I think it's a horribly complex area.
And given the size of the investment portfolios that many of the congregations now have, do you think it's sensible that they have one investment manager, or should they be starting to look at split their portfolios between two?
That's a nice question, isn't it? And I think it's what you feel comfortable with. Many congregations, I think if you've got many millions of pounds invested, you certainly should be thinking about whether one or two is a better number. The advantage of having two investment managers is you can possibly have a slightly different strategy. So you can have one that follows the strategy, complies with your ethical policy and so on, but you can then have another investment manager whose strategy is slightly different. So that, if you go back to March 2020, it's probably a bad example, but when the markets absolutely plummeted because of COVID, it was helpful for some charities to have two investment managers with slightly different investment strategies, whereas one portfolio probably didn't react quite as badly. And it sometimes gives you that added comfort. And just thinking going forward, if you have a congregation that does want its legacy to be grant making, for example, you might start to split your money and have part of your money in a portfolio that's specifically there to care for members. And that will be very much akin to a pension fund. But then you'd have another portfolio that is there to manage the money that you are going to give away. And the strategy for that may be very, very different. And so all of this ties in, doesn't it, to having that broader discussion and broader discernment about what do we want for the future.
And I think it all ties into impact reporting as well, doesn't it? Because again, one of the issues as a charity is having to be very public about what you're having to spend your money on, why you're accumulating money, why you've got reserves. Are you seeing changes in how people are addressing their trustee reports?
We're seeing some changes, and interestingly enough, one of the things that we're expecting within the next year or so is the next iteration of the SORP, Statement of Recommended Practice, which is, all charity accounts have to be drawn up in accordance with. What we're hearing is that there are two aspects to that revision. One will probably be to make the accounts slightly more simple. So they've become horribly complex in recent years. So simplification of the financial information, but much more onus on the trustees' report, on reporting back in terms of, yes, what as a charity, what difference has our work made, what difference has our money made? And so that impact reporting is very important. And it's an area I think that many religious congregations struggle with. I think it's because traditionally they've been quite reluctant to throw the spotlight on themselves and to blow their own trumpet. But even as congregations age, I think there's an awful lot that they continue to do, or their money continues to do, that should make that impact reporting not necessarily easy, but not too difficult. And it's about case studies. It's about, I had one congregation that did a wonderful report a couple of years ago now. They are in a situation where many of their members now are basically receiving care. But they talked about the prayer ministry, but they also did it in a wonderful way of looking back on the lives of those sisters and talking about what they had done in terms of devoting their lives to the poor, to ministry, and bringing alive really why it's right that the charity now should be caring for that sister and providing public benefit in that way. But those charities that are giving money, they can do case studies on what the recipient of that money has done. So whether that's their own congregation or whether it's a third-party organisation here in the UK. And there's still lots of examples of just day-to-day pastoral ministry. And one of the things you'll have heard me say is that in a trustee's report, the thing that is really powerful are quotes from beneficiaries, because that's somebody else saying this is a wonderful organisation, rather than the trustees and the congregation saying, hey, aren't we great? I think the other thing I always advise a congregation to do, if it's if you've got a provincial bursar or a provincial superior who's sitting there with a blank piece of paper and thinking, where do I start? Is just to go and talk to some of the people you meet on a day-to-day basis and say, just tell me, sounds rather silly, but what do I mean to you? What does our congregation mean to you? And you'll have plenty of material that really does bring home the impact these congregations have made, continue to make, and will continue to make for some time, I think.
And how important is it to explain investment strategy as well in the trustees report?
It's crucially important, because if you look at the balance sheet of some congregations, if you don't understand religious congregations, you quite justifiably would say, well, why is this organisation sitting on all of this money? And it goes back to that designated fund set aside for the future care. And the thing that sets aside a religious congregation charity from a mainstream charity is the religious congregation has an obligation to look after its members for the rest of their natural lives. Whereas a mainstream charity, in many ways, hopefully not, but it could give up its work tomorrow, it could close tomorrow with very little long-term commitments. And so the need to be able to finance that long-term commitment needs to be explained. And if you just look at a balance sheet, it will never do that. That's crucial in the trustees' report, therefore, to explain why that commitment exists, to talk about, why the charity should fund that, the public benefit of looking after the older members, and to explain that, that's expensive. If you've got a female member of a religious order, let's say she's 78 now, and let's say that she probably will need some form of care. Now, her expected life is probably somewhere around about 86, 87. Cost of care in this country at the moment, you're looking at 55, 60,000. Dementia care, you're looking at 100,000. To provide 55,000 for that sister of 78 for the rest of her natural life, you need £500,000. Now, if you multiply that by the number in the congregation, you suddenly start to come up with some very frightening but large figures. That needs to be pulled out in that trustees report. As I said, that figure is only going to go one way, unfortunately, because as members pass away, you don't need any money to look after them in the future. But it's still needed now, and it still needs to be explained. And the place to do that is the trustees report.
And you've mentioned the potential changes to SORP. Are there any other regulatory changes coming up on the financial side that are likely to be relevant?
I think the other thing that, I don't know whether it will be regulatory on the financial side, but the other thing that probably does need to be pulled out in the trustees report going forward is environmental issues. And large companies now have to report in the director's report about what they're doing in terms of caring for the environment, what their carbon footprint is. Now, there's a lack of consistency at the moment, and many directors' reports, when you read them, and where there is a need to report in this way, you need a degree in physics to actually understand what they're trying to get across. But that will soften, and there's no harm at all in religious congregations starting to address this in their trustees' report. And it will also answer some of the points we were talking about whether there is consistency between what you want of your investments and the way you're living your life as well, because you'll pull out the things that you're doing in your daily life that is reducing your carbon footprint and so on.
And have you seen many congregations thinking about modern slavery and reporting on that in there?
Very few report on it in the way that I think you're referring to, but many of them obviously are very involved themselves in ministry, in working with trafficked people, working with people that have gone through a nightmare in terms, again, of refugees coming over, reporting on that certainly in their trustees' report. And again, it pulls out that impact, doesn't it? That you can have one individual member of a congregation who's very involved in ministering and helping somebody who's had an absolute nightmare, they've been trafficked, but really making a difference to their life. And that's an excellent example of a case study, really, to really pull out. And addressing things like modern day slavery and things like that in that way, I think is absolutely a really good way of putting out the ongoing charitable work that congregations do and the good that they do.
I think we're certainly going to see a lot of those ideas that are very much in much more corporate commercial context about reporting feeding their way through into trustees' reports. So there's an interesting, that sort of the commercial sector feeding into the charitable sector.
Yeah.
And certainly on the legal side, I don't think there are any major regulatory changes afoot. Obviously, as you probably know, there's the Charities Bill that's currently before Parliament, which is predominantly about making some various technical changes. But it does have a few areas that are going to be useful to religious order charities. It's going to be much easier to change your purposes, and that's something that we've often struggled with when there's been a change of the definition of province, and that's actually impacted on the objects. Whereas now it's not going to be about terminology changing, it's about whether what the charity actually does changes. So that's interesting. There's also going to be much more flexibility around using permanent endowment. And thinking back to the property discussion we were having earlier, quite often properties are held to be used for specific charitable purposes, and it's going to be much easier to de-restrict that going forward. So some quite helpful changes coming in there. And also around property, because one of the barriers often to disposing of property is the Charities Act regulations and the need to get your qualifying surveyor's report, which sometimes if you're selling a 3-bed detached house can end up being a very expensive report. And the idea under some of the changes is it's actually going to be easier to use an estate agent to produce the report, and even an employee if you've got somebody in-house who can do that. So again, making it easier to look at that property portfolio and think about it. One of the challenges though may be a slight change around the rules for charity to charity transactions, because it's been very common in situations where there is a property to dispose of to transfer it to another charity and think actually because we're transferring it to another charity we can get round the provisions in the Act because it's simply to another charity following the same purposes. And now the rules are going to change slightly so that if price is a factor, then that takes you outside of the charity to charity exemption, and you'll end up having to go and get the best price that you possibly can. So there's a few changes there, but I think probably less of an impact than some of the reporting changes that might be coming.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of this just emphasises that the world doesn't stand still. And I suppose, we started this conversation by me referring back to the situation 20 years ago when congregations were starting to think about hiving off large institutions and so on. And I think in a way that was quite a moment in time. And my feeling is that we're approaching another key moment in time where thinking about future strategy is absolutely key, because all of what we've been discussing really is focused on changing circumstances, because demographics are changing, the age profile of congregations is changing in this country. And there is a need to think now about what is going to happen in the next 20 years. How do we want it to happen? What are the key decisions that we need to be making? And I think all of those are things that we're going to be discussing in our next session.
That's right. I think it very much builds into that theme, doesn't it, of what is the future, what are the changes we make for the future, and what is that next chapter of our life as a congregation, and in fact who's involved in writing and making the decisions around that chapter.
Very much so. So it's something to look forward to.
Yes.